You're sitting in your car, completely relaxed, music playing, no stress, no rush. Then it happens. Blue and red lights flood your rearview mirror. Your stomach drops. Your hands tighten on the wheel. And in the next 60 seconds, without even realizing it, you will either protect yourself completely or hand over every legal right you have. Not because you did something terrible. Not because you panicked. Because you said one sentence. Just one. And once those words leave your mouth, the stop is no longer a stop. It becomes something else entirely. Searches begin. Time disappears. Situations spiral. And the entire time you're sitting there thinking, I was just trying to be cooperative. This is not about extreme cases or dramatic confrontations. This happens to regular people on regular roads during completely unremarkable drives. A Tuesday commute. A weekend road trip. A 5-minute errand. The terrifying part is how predictable it is. The same question, the same response, the same outcome, playing out thousands of times every single day across American highways. Drivers walking straight into a trap they were never warned existed. But here is what changes everything. Once you know exactly what is happening in those opening moments, once you understand the one legal dynamic that governs the entire interaction, you stop being a passenger in your own traffic stop. You become someone who actually knows how to move through it. Someone who walks away in 8 minutes instead of sitting on the side of the road for 40. And that shift starts right now. Hi, I'm Zahid, and I have spent a significant amount of time doing something most people would find surprisingly eye-opening. I analyzed over 200 real body camera videos from actual traffic stops, studying frame by frame exactly what unfolds during those critical first minutes on the roadside. And what I found was not what most people expect. It was not aggressive policing. It was not dramatic confrontations. It was something far quieter and far more consistent. The drivers who ended up in the worst situations were not necessarily doing anything majorly wrong. They simply did not understand how the interaction actually works. They answered questions the way any reasonable person would. They tried to be helpful, cooperative, honest. And ironically, precisely because of that, they put themselves at a serious disadvantage. In this video, I am going to walk you through the specific highway law dynamic that almost no driver has ever been taught. The 3 exact phrases that immediately protect you during a stop, and how a situation that typically drags on for 20 minutes can instead be completely finished in under 8. By the time this ends, traffic stops will never look the same to you again. You will know exactly what to say, exactly when to say it, and you will never be caught off guard again when those lights appear behind you. Here is where the vast majority of drivers go wrong, and it is not carelessness, it is conditioning. From the moment we learn to drive, we are taught that a traffic stop is simple. Lights come on, you pull over, hand over your documents, answer a few questions, and wait for the officer to decide what happens. It feels routine, almost automatic, but that version of events leaves out something absolutely critical. A traffic stop is not a casual roadside conversation. It is a structured legal interaction with very specific boundaries, and those boundaries are being tested from the very first second the officer steps out of their vehicle. Officers are trained to use the opening moments of a stop for far more than confirming a violation. They are observing your behavior, your tone, your answers, your hesitations. Every word you speak is being actively processed, not casually, but as potential information that can shape everything that follows. And while most drivers believe they are simply being polite and cooperative, what is actually happening is that they are unknowingly constructing a legal foundation that can justify extending the stop well beyond its original purpose. This is the precise point where federal highway enforcement practices collide directly with your constitutional rights, specifically your Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. And that collision is where everything begins to shift. Because the moment the initial reason for the stop starts to blur, whether it was speeding, a broken taillight, or drifting slightly out of a lane, the entire interaction can expand. More questions, more scrutiny, more time. And it usually begins so subtly that drivers never notice the transition happening. But if you know what to watch for, you will recognize that it almost always starts the same way. With one question that sounds harmless, almost conversational, but carries far more weight than anyone realizes. It comes within seconds of the officer reaching your window. You have probably heard it before, or you absolutely will at some point. Do you know why I pulled you over today? On the surface, it sounds like a basic, even considerate way to open the interaction. But this is not small talk. This is one of the most consistently effective and widely used approaches in any traffic stop, and the reason is straightforward. It is because of what it quietly invites you to do next. The moment you respond with anything specific, you are no longer simply answering a question. You are potentially making a verbal admission on the record, and that matters enormously. If you say, "I think I was going a little fast," you have just acknowledged speeding without seeing a single piece of evidence. If you say, "I might have drifted a bit," you have provided a statement that can be used to support further investigation. These words do not disappear. They get documented, included in reports, and can later be referenced in legal proceedings as part of the officer's account of what occurred during the stop. And the reason this works so reliably is because it feels completely natural. And that distinction matters deeply because now the direction of the stop is guided by evidence rather than your own words. Legally, this aligns with your Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. Courts have consistently recognized that roadside questioning carries those same implications even though you are not inside a police station. So in that very first exchange, in those opening few seconds, you are already setting the tone for everything that follows. Most drivers never recognize it, but this is the precise moment where the entire trajectory of the stop begins to take shape. The tone is relaxed. The setting feels completely routine. There is no obvious pressure, no raised voices, no signal that anything serious is taking place. The instant you offer an admission, even a minor one, you have shifted that balance. You have made their task easier. You have filled in gaps that they would otherwise need to justify independently. But when you use a composed, respectful, and non-committal response, you shift that dynamic entirely. Now the officer must rely on what they actually observed rather than what you assumed or confirmed for them. And that single shift can meaningfully limit how far the stop can reasonably extend. This is not about being uncooperative or evasive. It is about recognizing that every structured interaction has rules. And once you understand those rules, you can move through the situation without unintentionally creating serious problems for yourself. Most drivers never realize how much influence they actually hold in those opening moments because it does not feel like influence. It feels like answering a simple question. But in reality, it is the first point where the entire direction of the stop can either stay focused and narrow or begin quietly expanding. And that expansion is where the second layer comes in. Because once the initial question passes, the stop does not simply pause. It evolves. This is the part most people fail to recognize while it is actively happening. The officer may begin asking what appear to be casual, friendly questions. Where are you headed? Where are you coming from? How long have you been on the road today? On the surface, it sounds like conversation, perhaps even an attempt to be personable. But legally, something very deliberate is taking place in the background. These questions are being used to work toward what is legally known as reasonable suspicion, a threshold that allows an officer to extend the stop well beyond its original stated purpose. And this is where a routine traffic stop can quietly evolve into something far longer and far more invasive. Because once the original reason for pulling you over has been addressed, the officer cannot legally continue holding you there without a new and justified reason. That principle was established clearly in a landmark Supreme Court case called Rodriguez versus United States. The ruling confirmed that a traffic stop must remain connected to its original purpose, and extending it even by a matter of minutes requires independent justification. But here is the critical issue. Most drivers never challenge that extension. Not because they agree with it, but because they do not realize they have the ability to do so. They sit there answering additional questions, waiting for the interaction to conclude, assuming the officer has complete control over how long they remain there. In reality, you have a very specific and completely legitimate way to redirect the stop back to its legal boundaries. And it comes down to one simple, direct question. At the appropriate moment, once your documents have been handed over and the original reason for the stop has been established, you ask, "Officer, am I free to go once you have finished with my documents?" That is the entire question. No attitude, no confrontation, no escalation. Just a clear and measured inquiry. And what that does is subtle but genuinely powerful. It signals that you understand the stop has a defined scope and a natural conclusion. It places the responsibility back on the officer to either wrap up the interaction or clearly articulate why it is being extended beyond its original purpose. Now compare that to what most drivers actually do, which is nothing at all. They wait, they answer more questions, They comply without ever once clarifying the timeline. And in that silence, the stop stretches. More questions get asked, more time passes, and what should have been a brief interaction becomes something far more drawn out and stressful. But when you ask that one question, you are not being resistant. You are anchoring the interaction to its legal parameters, and that alone can dramatically change how long you spend sitting on the side of that road. To fully understand just how significant that one question truly is, you need to appreciate how little time it actually takes for a stop to cross a legal line. In the Rodriguez case, the situation was not dramatic. There was no high-speed pursuit, no major confrontation, no obvious turning point that anyone could point to. It was simply an extra 7 to 8 minutes that passed after the original purpose of the stop had already been fully addressed. 7 minutes. That was sufficient for the Supreme Court to determine that the extension was unlawful because it was not supported by independent reasonable suspicion. Consider that for a moment. Most drivers would not even think twice about a delay that brief. You are already pulled over, already waiting, so a few extra minutes barely registers. But legally, those minutes carry enormous weight. They represent the difference between a valid stop and a direct violation of your rights. And the reason that line gets crossed so frequently is simple. Nobody challenges it in real time. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, just clearly and calmly. When you ask, "Am I free to go once you have finished with my documents?" you are doing precisely what the principles from that case protect. You are drawing attention to the timeline. You are making it understood that you recognize the stop has a beginning, a defined purpose, and an endpoint. And in many cases, that is entirely sufficient to bring things back on track. Officers know the legal standard. They know where the boundary sits. But if that boundary is never acknowledged by anyone, it becomes far too easy for the stop to drift past it without any resistance. That is exactly why this question is so effective. It does not manufacture conflict, it creates clarity. And in a situation like a traffic stop, clarity is genuinely one of the most valuable tools available to you. Now here is the moment where everything tightens, because there is one specific point in a traffic stop where the entire situation can shift direction in a matter of seconds. No gradual buildup, no warning, just one question that determines everything that happens next. And it almost always sounds completely casual, as though the decision has practically already been made. The officer might say, "You mind if I take a quick look inside your vehicle?" Or, "I am just going to check your car real quick, okay?" The tone is relaxed, the phrasing is soft. And that final word, "okay," is doing far more work than most people recognize. It is carefully constructed to guide you toward agreement before you have had a genuine moment to think it through. Because legally, if the officer lacks a warrant and lacks probable cause, there is precisely one thing that authorizes them to search your vehicle. Your consent. That is it. And the moment you provide it, even casually, even unintentionally, every protection that would otherwise apply simply vanishes. Most drivers do not decline in that moment. Not because they actually want a search conducted, but because saying no feels socially uncomfortable. They think, "I have nothing to hide." Or they assume agreeing will make the stop conclude faster. So they say, "Sure, go ahead." Or they nod. Or they step out of the car without fully processing what they have just agreed to. And from that point forward, the search is legally valid. Not because of evidence, because of permission. Now compare that to a response that keeps everything firmly within your control. When the request comes, you say clearly and calmly, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." No explanation attached, no extra words added, just that sentence. And what happens immediately after is significant. The entire dynamic shifts. Because now, instead of relying on your permission to proceed, the officer must rely on actual legal justification. They need probable cause, or the stop continues without a search taking place. That single sentence forces the interaction back into a framework where your rights remain completely intact. And this is not a loophole or a legal trick. It is a principle that has been firmly upheld for decades. In Schneckloth versus Bustamante, the Supreme Court made it explicitly clear that consent must be voluntary, which means it can also be declined, calmly, legally, without that refusal serving as grounds for any penalty on its own. Once you understand that, the pressure you feel to agree in that moment starts to dissolve, because you are no longer simply reacting to an unexpected request. You are making a deliberate, informed decision, one that keeps the entire situation from expanding beyond what the law actually permits. Once you fully understand that moment, everything about a traffic stop begins to look different. Because what previously appeared to be a polite and routine request now reveals itself as a genuine turning point. The instant you clearly state, "I do not consent to any searches," you have accomplished something the vast majority of drivers never do. You have placed the burden back exactly where it belongs. Up until that point, the interaction has been moving forward largely on the basis of your cooperation. But the moment consent is removed from the equation, the officer must rely on something else entirely: actual, articulable, probable cause. And if that does not exist, the path forward becomes dramatically narrower. This is precisely why that single sentence carries so much weight. It does not escalate the situation. It does not create conflict. It simply defines a boundary. And when that boundary is clearly established, the overall tone of the stop frequently changes. After reviewing hundreds of real traffic stop recordings, one pattern appears consistently. Drivers who politely but firmly decline consent tend to experience shorter and more focused interactions. Not because they receive different treatment, but because the legal scope of what can happen has been meaningfully limited. There is no longer an open invitation to explore beyond the original reason for the stop. The interaction stays contained, and that is the entire goal. Not to win the encounter, not to challenge authority for its own sake, simply to move through it without unintentionally expanding it beyond what was ever necessary. Most people never recognize this distinction because they have spent years being taught that cooperation means agreement. But those two things are not the same. You can be entirely cooperative, providing your documents, following all instructions, remaining respectful and composed throughout, while still declining requests that go beyond what is actually required of you. And that balance is where your real control lives. It is not about saying more. It is about knowing precisely what not to say. Now, to see how all of this plays out in an actual situation, picture a completely ordinary scenario. You are on the highway, a few hours into a drive, probably thinking about your next stop. You drift slightly over the speed limit. Nothing dramatic, just enough to be noticed. A moment later, the lights appear. You pull over, heart rate rising slightly, but nothing feels particularly alarming yet. The officer approaches, and like countless stops before it, the first question arrives. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" In the version that plays out for most drivers, you respond quickly, wanting to seem honest and cooperative. "Yeah, I think I was going a little fast." It feels responsible even. But in that moment, you have just confirmed the violation before a single piece of evidence has been formally established. The officer takes your documents, returns to their vehicle, and when they come back, more questions follow. "Where are you headed? Where are you coming from?" You answer each one, filling the silence, trying to be helpful. A few minutes pass, and then comes the shift. "You mind if I take a quick look inside your car?" It is framed casually, almost like a formality. And because everything has felt routine up to this point, you say, "Sure." What follows is a 20-plus minute search conducted on the side of the road. Nothing is found, but the time is gone. The stress has accumulated, and the situation has stretched far beyond anything you anticipated when you first saw those lights. Now run that exact same scenario again, but with a different approach. The lights come on, you pull over, and the officer asks that same opening question. This time, instead of guessing, you respond with composure. "Officer, I am happy to cooperate fully. I do not believe I was doing anything wrong." No admission, no extra explanation, just a clear, measured response. You provide your documents, and once the reason for the stop is established, you ask directly, "Am I free to go once you have finished with my documents?" The question arrives without tension. The officer proceeds with whatever the original purpose required: a citation, a warning, whatever it may be. Then the same request appears. "You mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" And this time you respond just as clearly. "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." No apology, no justification offered, just the boundary stated plainly. And from there, the interaction stays exactly where it was always supposed to remain. No extended delay, no unnecessary escalation. Within minutes, you are back on the road. Same highway, same initial stop, completely different outcome. And the difference had nothing to do with luck, timing, or even the officer involved. It came down to 3 sentences. 3 specific moments where the direction of the stop could have shifted dramatically but did not. Because you understood what was happening as it was happening. And once you see that contrast laid out directly side by side, it becomes undeniably clear just how much control most drivers are unknowingly giving away, and how straightforward it genuinely is to change that. At this point, you may find yourself wondering whether all of this is simply strategic thinking or whether it is actually grounded in something more substantive. And that is an important distinction worth addressing directly, because nothing presented here depends on loopholes or technicalities. Every principle discussed is built on well-established legal foundations that have been refined over decades through landmark Supreme Court decisions. When you choose not to respond to a question with an admission, you are aligning yourself with your Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination, which applies even during roadside questioning. In Berkmer versus McCarty, the court made clear that the pressures inherent in a traffic stop do not eliminate those protections simply because you are standing on pavement rather than sitting inside an interrogation room. When you ask whether you are free to leave once your documents are processed, you are reinforcing the standard articulated in Rodriguez versus United States, that a stop must remain tied to its original purpose and cannot be extended without independent justification. And when you decline a search, you are exercising a right affirmed in Schneckloth versus Bustamante, where the court confirmed that consent must be truly voluntary, meaning it can absolutely be refused. Even the broader framework governing brief detentions established in Terry versus Ohio supports the foundational idea that these interactions have defined and enforceable limits. Together, these rulings do not simply exist as abstract theory. They actively shape how every lawful traffic stop is supposed to function in practice. And once you understand that foundation, the entire interaction becomes far less uncertain. You are no longer guessing your way through it. You are operating within a structure that already exists specifically to protect you. And this is where a modest shift in awareness can produce a lasting difference. Because the reality is that most drivers will never be taught any of this. Not in driver's education, not in any routine conversation, not even after years of experience on the road. It is something people typically learn the hard way, after a situation has already stretched further than it ever should have. But it does not have to go that way. If you have stayed with this video to this point, you already understand more about how these interactions genuinely work than the overwhelming majority of drivers on the road. And more importantly, you now know how rapidly everything can change based on just a few carefully chosen words. If you want to go deeper into specific scenarios, particularly situations where an officer claims to detect an odor coming from the vehicle, which introduces an entirely separate and significantly more complex layer of legal considerations, make sure you are following along so you do not miss that breakdown, because that is one of the most widely misunderstood situations any driver can face, and it is precisely where these principles get tested in the most direct and consequential way. For now, focus on locking in what you have already learned, because the value is not simply in understanding it here in this moment. It is in being able to recall it clearly when it actually matters most. By now, everything narrows down to simplicity, not more information, not additional complexity, just 3 clear moments and 3 exact sentences that anchor the entire interaction. Because when those lights appear behind you, you will not be thinking about court cases or legal theory. You will be reacting in real time. And that is precisely why this needs to be immediately and effortlessly recallable. The first moment is the question you will almost certainly hear within seconds of the officer reaching your window. Do you know why I pulled you over? Rather than guessing, rather than filling the silence with something that could be used against you, you remain composed and respond. Officer, I am happy to cooperate fully. I do not believe I was doing anything wrong. No admission, no assumptions, just a steady, grounded response that keeps everything in a safe position. The second moment arrives after the purpose of the stop has been established and your documents are being processed. This is where time can begin stretching quietly if nothing is said. So you introduce clarity with one precise question. Am I free to go once you have finished with my documents? That single line draws a clear boundary without generating any tension whatsoever. And the third moment, the one capable of changing everything in an instant, is the search request. However it is phrased, however casual or routine it may sound, your response remains unchanged. Officer, I do not consent to any searches. No additional words, no explanation offered. Just a clear and deliberate decision that keeps your protections fully intact. 3 sentences. That is the entire framework. Not complicated, not aggressive, not confrontational, just precise. And when you bring them together, they produce a fundamentally different kind of interaction. One where you are cooperative but not exposed, respectful but not unguarded. Because ultimately, none of this exists in theory. This is about a moment that can occur on any drive, on any road, at any time. A long trip, a short commute, a completely ordinary afternoon. And in that moment, the difference between a routine stop and a drawn-out, stressful ordeal frequently comes down to what you say before you even realize it matters. Most people never think about it until afterward, replaying the interaction in their mind, wondering how it escalated or why it lasted so much longer than it should have. But now you will not be in that position. You will recognize the structure as it unfolds. You will know exactly where the turning points are. And most importantly, you will know precisely how to move through them without unintentionally making things harder for yourself. If there is one thing worth carrying forward from everything covered here, it is this. Awareness creates options. It gives you the space to respond thoughtfully instead of simply reacting. And that alone can completely transform the experience. So the next time those lights appear behind you, it will not feel unpredictable or disorienting. It will feel familiar, controlled, defined, and you will know exactly what to do.